Hello and welcome to today's edition of The Jungle. Today we're going to read pages 35 to 43. It's going to be kind of a longer section today. So, Jurgis has just gotten a job in Packingtown. He's very proud of that. He still has this attitude that if I work really hard, I will be successful. In the meantime, before his job actually starts, he and Ona go on a tour of Packingtown led by this family friend, Jacobus Sevelius. So they're touring the actual butchering facilities. Have you had breakfast yet? Lunch? Where are you in your day with eating? You might want to check that out. Maybe stay away from bacon and sausage for today. Okay. Entering one of the Durham buildings, they found a number of other visitors waiting, and before long there came a guide to escort them through the place. They made a great feature of showing strangers through the packing plants, for it is good advertisement. But Ponus Jacobus whispered maliciously that the visitors did not see any more than the packers wanted them to. They climbed a long series of stairways outside of the building to the top of its 5 or 6 stories. Here was the chute with its river of hogs, all patiently toiling upward. There was a place for them to rest and cool off, and then another passageway. They went into a room from which there is no returning for hogs. It was a long, narrow room with a gallery along it for visitors. At the head, there was a great iron wheel, about 20 feet in circumference, with rings here and there along its edge. Upon both sides of this wheel, there was a narrow space, into which came the hogs at the end of their journey. In the midst of them stood a great, burly Negro, bare-armed and bare-chested. Okay, if you're following along in the book, the word Negro is capitalized, and it's part of the original edition. It's something that editors have to think about. At the time that this book was written, in the early 1900s, referring to somebody with dark skin as a capital letter Negro was totally the most politically correct way to do it, and Upton Sinclair is trying to be absolutely not racist about this. Today, I hope that feels a little bit weird and racist still. I mean, we're 100 years, almost 120 some years past this book. And things have changed a lot, and that feels awkward. But, so, as they publish new editions of the book, do they keep that as part of the original context, or does that detract from the story, and, it's something that they need to update? It's the kind of question that editors try and answer. In this case, they've chosen to keep it. In the midst of them stood a great burly Negro, bare-armed and bare-chested. He was resting for the moment, for the wheel had stopped while men were cleaning up. In a minute or two, however, it began slowly to revolve, and then the men upon each side of it sprang to work. They had chains which they fastened about the leg of the nearest hog, and the other end of the chain they hooked into one of the rings upon the wheel. So, as the wheel turned, a hog was suddenly jerked off his feet and borne aloft. At the same instant, the ear was assailed by a most terrifying shriek. The visitors started in alarm. The women turned pale and shrank back. The shriek was followed by another, louder and yet more agonizing, for once started upon that journey, the hog never came back. At the top of the wheel, he was shunted off upon a trolley and went sailing down the room. And meantime, another was swung up, and then another, until there was a double line of them, each dangling by a foot and kicking in frenzy and squealing. The uproar was appalling, perilous to the eardrums. One feared that there was too much sound for the room to hold, that the walls must give way or the ceiling crack. There were high squeals and low squeals, grunts and wails of agony. There would come a momentary lull, and then a fresh outburst, louder than ever, surging up to a deafening climax. It was too much for some of the visitors. The men would look at each other, laughing nervously, and the women would stand with hands clenched, and the blood rushing to their faces, and the tears starting in their eyes. Meantime, heedless of all these things, the men upon the floor were going about their work. Neither squeals of hogs nor tears of visitors made any difference to them. One by one they hooked up the hogs, and one by one with a swift stroke they slit their throats. There was a long line of hogs, with squeals and lifeblood ebbing away together, until at last each started again and vanished with a splash into a huge vat of boiling water. It was all so very businesslike. that one watched it fascinated. It was pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics. And yet, somehow, the most matter-of-fact person could not help thinking of the hogs. They were so innocent. They came so very trustingly, and they were so very human in their protests, and so perfectly within their rights. They had done nothing to deserve it, and it was adding insult to injury as the thing was done here, swinging them up in this cold-blooded, impersonal way without a pretense of apology, without the homage of a tear. Now and then a visitor wept, to be sure, but this slaughtering machine ran on, visitors or no visitors. It was like some horrible crime, committed in a dungeon, all unseen and unheeded, buried out of sight and memory. One could not stand and watch very long without becoming philosophical, without beginning to deal in symbols and similes, and to hear the hog squeal of the universe. Was it permitted to believe that there was nowhere upon the earth or above the earth a heaven for hogs, where they were requited for all this suffering? Each one of these hogs was a separate creature. Some were white hogs, some were black, some were brown, some were spotted, some were old, some were young, some were long and lean, some were monstrous. And each of them had an individuality of his own, a will of his own, a hope and a heart's desire. Each was full of self-confidence, of self-importance, and a sense of dignity. And trusting and strong in faith, he had gone about his business. All the while a black shadow hung over him, and a horrid fate waited in his pathway. Now, suddenly, it had swooped upon him and had seized him by the leg. Relentless, remorseless it was. All of his protests, his screams, were nothing to it. It did its cruel will with him, as if his wishes, his feelings, had simply no existence at all. It cut his throat and watched him gasp out his life. And now, was one to believe that there was nowhere a god of hogs to whom this hog personality was precious, to whom these hog squeals and agonies had a meaning? Who would take this hog into his arms and comfort him, reward him for his work well done, and show him the meaning of his sacrifice? Perhaps some glimpse of all this was in the thoughts of our humble-minded Jurgis, as he turned to go on with the rest of the party and muttered, "Diev, but I'm glad I'm not a hog." The carcass hog was scooped out of the vat by machinery, and then it fell to the second floor, passing on the way through a wonderful machine with numerous scrapers, which adjusted themselves to the size and the shape of the animal, and sent it out at the other end with nearly all of the bristles removed. It was then again strung up by machinery and sent upon another trolley ride, this time passing between two lines of men who sat upon a raised platform, each doing a certain single thing to the carcass as it came to him. One scraped the outside of a leg, another scraped the inside of the same leg. One with a swift stroke cut the throat, another with 2 swift strokes severed the head, which fell to the floor and vanished through a hole. Another made a slit down the body, a second opened the body wider, a third with a saw cut the breastbone, a fourth loosened the entrails, a fifth pushed them out, and they also slid through the hole in the floor. There were men to scrape each side, and men to scrape the back, and there were men to clean the carcass inside, to trim it and wash it. Looking down this room, one saw, creeping slowly, a line of dangling hogs 100 yards in length, and for every yard there was a man, working as if a demon were after him. At the end of the hog's progress, every inch of the carcass had been gone over several times, and then it was rolled into the chilling room, where it stayed for 24 hours, and where a stranger might lose himself in a forest of freezing hogs. Before the carcass was admitted here, however, it had to pass a government inspector, who sat in the doorway and felt of the glands in the neck for tuberculosis. Okay, a couple things. You have glands in your groin area, in your armpits, in your neck. They're often places where your body produces hormones. Like they're often called lymph nodes in today's terminology. So your glands are one of the first places that you can be noticing that your body is fighting some sort of infection or disease. That often your glands will get kind of swollen from the overwork of your immune system. And so tuberculosis in particular is a disease that both animals and people can get. It killed a lot of people in the 17, 18, 1900s. It's almost unheard of in the United States today, but it still exists in a lot of other people. It's a lung disease that causes you to basically drown to death in the fluids that your body produces. There were all kinds of rumors that, throughout history, mythology behind tuberculosis. This is where vampirism comes from, most likely, because when you have tuberculosis, some people, they wasted away over months and months and months with tuberculosis, but it caused you to be extremely tired, and of course, when you laid down at night, the fluid collected in your lungs even more than during the day when you were at least standing up and moving around a little bit. And so people would wake up extremely tired and just completely drained and having visibly lost weight overnight from their body fighting against this, the ability to, trying to breathe. And so this is one place where rumors of vampires started, that there were vampires who came in the night and who were sucking people dry. Tuberculosis is definitely a problem during this time period. It's an airborne disease, frequently caused or spread by coughing and spitting, little bits of spit that fly out of your mouth when you're talking, which is why in the days of COVID-19, they're telling people to wear a face mask. It's not so much to protect you against the other people, it's to keep those little droplets of spit from flying out of your mouth and potentially infecting somebody else, whether you have any symptoms or not. It seems to be possible that you can still be spreading COVID-19. Tuberculosis the same way, except they didn't understand about germs at all, so people are still very much at work. They are spitting on the floors all the time. There's a lot of coughing and sneezing and not covering because people didn't understand that was at least a better way to not spread germs to other people. Okay, before the carcass was admitted here, however, it had to pass a government inspector who sat in the doorway and felt of the glands in the neck for tuberculosis. This government inspector did not have the manner of a man who was worked to death. He was apparently not haunted by a fear that the hog might get by him before he had finished his testing. If you were a sociable person, he was quite willing to enter into a conversation with you and explain to you the deadly nature of the ptomaines which are found in tubercular pork. And while he was talking with you, you could hardly be so ungrateful as to notice that a dozen carcasses were passing by him untouched. This inspector wore a blue uniform with brass buttons, and he gave an atmosphere of authority to the scene, and as it were, put the stamp of official approval on things which were done at Durham's. So all of that is to say, he looks very official, he makes it look like all of the food and the meat is being inspected, and really, he is doing nothing. He's sitting around talking a lot, and a lot of the meat is getting by him without ever having been inspected. Because the Pure Food and Drug Act hasn't been passed yet, not until 1906, after this book comes out, and people suddenly realize exactly how their food, where their food is coming from. Jurgis went down the line with the rest of the visitors, staring open-mouthed, lost in wonder. He had dressed hogs himself in the forest of Lithuania, but he had never expected to live to see one hog dressed by several hundred men. It was like a wonderful poem to him, and he took it all in guilelessly, even to the conspicuous signs demanding immaculate cleanliness of the employees. Jurgis was vexed when the cynical Jacobus translated these signs with sarcastic comments, offering to take them to the secret rooms, where the spoil meats went to be doctored. The party descended to the next floor where the various waste materials were treated. Here came the entrails to be scraped and washed clean for sausage casings. So, when you try and cut through a brat, how sometimes it's really hard, there's that outer, skin on it? Oh, guess what? It's pig intestines. That's what's most commonly used for a sausage casing. So, let's do intestines real fast. Intestines are this huge amount, I think I got it written down here. If you're a full-grown adult, you have about 28 feet of intestines inside your abdominal cavity. And you're thinking, nuh-uh, that's not possible. Yeah, it is. They're all squished in there, and if somebody cuts your stomach open, they all flop out. So your intestines are after your stomach and before your bowels, where you poop things out. Your intestines do a lot of squeezing. They get the final water out of food. They get the final nutrients out of the food, and they push it through all this 28 feet of piping in your body to do that process. By the time they get to your bowels, to your colon and your bowels, there's nothing usable left in that food, and then it gets pooped out. Well, the same is true for pigs. They have the same, similar kind of system. So your intestines are very flexible. They're like tubes. It's like pipes, but it's a very flexible pipe that grows and shrinks due to the contents inside, and that also has a muscular power to be able to squeeze on the contents. So they make great sausage casings because you can stuff them really, really full of meat. That's still largely what we use today. So you're eating pig intestines. They clean all the poop, or pre-poop, whatever you want to call it, out of the intestines and fill them back full of meat. Here came the entrails to be scraped and washed clean for sausage casings. Men and women worked here in the midst of a sickening stench, which caused the visitors to hasten by, gasping. To another room came all the scraps to be tanked, which meant boiling and pumping off the grease to make soap and lard. Below they took out the refuse, and this too was a region in which the visitors did not linger. In still other places, men were engaged in cutting up the carcasses that had been through the chilling rooms. First, there were the splitters, the most expert workmen in the plant, who earned as high as 50 cents an hour, and did not a thing all day except chop hogs down the middle. Then there were the cleaver men, great giants with muscles of iron. Each had 2 men to attend him, to slide the half-carcass in front of him on the table and hold it while he chopped it, then to turn each piece so that he might chop it once more. His cleaver had a blade about 2 feet long, and he never made but one cut, and he made it so neatly, too, that his implement did not smite through and dull itself. There was just enough force for a perfect cut, and no more. Okay, so if you looked at that document that I sent out through Edpuzzle the other day with a bunch of photos in it, there are pictures of the cleaver men. So they have this giant knife, basically, and there are 2 guys positioned on either side, and the cleaver man is just continuously chopping, and these 2 guys on the side have to kind of dash in and turn the hog so that he's constantly chopping in a different place. You don't want to be the 2 turning guys, because what are the chances that one day you're a little slow, or the cleaver guy's off just a little bit, and he chops off your hand, or your finger, or your entire arm, or into the back of your head, or whatever happens to be exposed? It's pretty high, and if that happens to you, guess what? You're fired, if you're not dead. And the company doesn't have to pay your family anything, there's no restitution, there's no workers' comp, nothing. So through various yawning holes there slipped to the floor below, to one room hams, to another forequarters, to another sides of pork. One might go down to this floor and see the pickling rooms, where the hams were put into vats, and the great smoke rooms with their airtight iron doors. In another room they prepared salt pork. There were whole cellars full of it, built up in great towers to the ceiling. Yet another room, they were putting up meats in boxes and barrels and wrapping hams and bacon in oiled paper, sealing and labeling and sewing them. From the doors of these rooms went men with loaded trucks to the platform where freight cars were waiting to be filled, and one went out there and realized with a start that he had come at last to the ground floor of this enormous building. Okay, we're going to stop there because I know I said page 43. This is page 40. We're going to stop before we get into the beef butchering industry because this one's been long enough.